Justice Ginsburg's death is already having an impact on voter turnout. One day after Ginsburg's death, lines were out the door at some polling places in Virginia where early voting began last week. Many voters there telling us the death of Justice Ginsburg motivated them to come out and vote early. Will Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death have an impact in swing states when the election results are in? MSNBC host Ali Velshi spoke to voters from both parties in Kenosha, Wisconsin.
It's sad, and it leaves a hole that needs to be filled. She was wonderful for women. You know, she stood up for women to equal pay. You know, I don't know a whole lot about what she did. I know it was extensive.
Well, that was one of the biggest deals, the Lilly Ledbetter law.
Thank you.
She was so she would be very pleased that that's the thing you know about.
Yes, we all want to thank her for that. But her seat does need to get filled right away. There were things that I don't agree with that she did stand up for, of course, but, you know, she's going to be missed. She was a wonderful pillar.
I just hope that now that her life is being celebrated on TV and people are getting to know more things about her, I hope that a lot of people take the fact how she was just as close with her conservative peers as she was her liberals, and how they work together. And I really hope that that inspires other leaders to do the same.
Angela, you are a lawyer.
I am.
So what's your, I mean, it's such an interesting day to talk to women, to talk to people who've been involved in civil rights, because they sort of see what they want in Ruth Bader Ginsburg as a champion of causes not typical of someone on the bench.
Absolutely. I mean, on the one hand, as a woman, that was a hard hit. She was someone that I respected and someone who paved the way for other women to be involved in the law. And also as an attorney who is civil, you know, who's minded in civil rights, to have someone in such power who unapologetically fights for causes that I would argue, you know, for the little people, that's something that I strive to be half of what she's done with her life. I think the politicizing of the Supreme Court is kind of scary, and I suspect that Justice Bader Ginsburg, that's not what she wanted and what her will was, and I suspect that that's why she tried to hang on until at least we had made it through the election and made it through inauguration.
Ali joins me now from Kenosha, Wisconsin. Ali, what a cross-section. Now, most of us know Kenosha because of the police shooting of Jacob Blake earlier this summer. Now, with the death of Justice Ginsburg, what are the issues that the voters there seem to be most concerned about?
Well, it was interesting. Nobody had a bad word to say about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which is obvious. But the Republicans on the panel wanted that position filled very quickly. The Democrats obviously didn't. With Republicans, they were talking about religious freedom. They were talking about abortion. They were talking about the economy, which polls are indicating people believe that Donald Trump is a strong performer on the economy. With the Democrats on my panel, they were more interested in other things. They were talking about justice and the racial issues in the country. There was a very hearty debate between the participants about whether systemic racism is really a thing or it isn't. The Democrats felt that not only is it a real thing, but it's the kind of thing that Donald Trump is exacerbating. The Republicans didn't see it that way. It was also very clear, Gotti, that they were getting their news from different places because their perspectives, particularly the Republicans on the panel, were really parroting the kinds of things that you hear Donald Trump saying at his rally. So it was a useful enterprise. Nobody in the end of it agreed with each other, but we spent an hour talking to each other, and that was useful, Gotti.
And it seemed very cordial.
It was. It was. And that's part of the deal. We invite these people to come and have a conversation with us every weekend. And we sort of say it's free for anybody to say whatever they want, but let's everybody try and be nice. And they all agree at the end that that in itself is an exercise that Americans should go through and that might help us bridge the divide.
Absolutely. We need so much more of that, Ali. There's, as I understand it, one more month until early voting begins there in Wisconsin. What did the voters there tell you about how they plan to vote? Are they talking in person or possibly by mail?
Well, first I asked them, first of all, who they were all voting for. And while there were 2 independents, 2 Democrats, and 2 Republicans, 3 people were voting for Donald Trump, 3 people were voting for Joe Biden. The Republicans were quite pleased about the idea that they were going to vote in person. In fact, the ones voting for Donald Trump didn't even wear a mask for the conversation, which typically takes place with us, but we had everybody properly social distanced. The Democrats had all said that they were going to be voting absentee or by mail. So, again, that is splitting the way we're largely seeing surveys and polls indicating that Americans are thinking about the election.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.